Thank you, Paul, and thank you very much for organizing this event. Paul's letting me go first, a little out of order maybe, because we do have a rather important House Leaders meeting. I did invite the House Leader for the Liberals and the NDP to come, and I don't know whether they will come or not, because they were having a meeting, but I do want to just begin by thanking you for being here today, and particularly our veterans. Some of them I've met about 3 times now, and I was saying to a couple of them, you sort of have a permanent place here in our caucus room at Queen's Park, so welcome. And I want to begin by thanking the other 2 House Leaders. As you know, I'll be introducing the bill this afternoon to recognize the Merchant Marine Veterans Day, which will be September 3rd from now on, if the bill passes. And I can't do that, and we couldn't do that as a PC caucus without the cooperation of all members of the House, because it's done on unanimous consent. It only takes 1 of 107 members to say no, and it wouldn't be able to be done. So thank you to the other leaders and parties. The victory in Europe ended a long and bitter conflict without parallel in our history. Several million men and women from Canada, the US, Britain, and other countries had left their homes behind to liberate Europe. We know that hundreds of thousands did not return. Now, that was a generation that found themselves on the fault line of history, and it rose magnificently to the challenge, cementing Canadians' reputation as a brave and just people. On behalf of all the members of Parliament and all Ontarians, I want to thank those of you here today and all veterans, along with their families, for their leadership. You led us to freedom, you led us to democracy, you led us not only in war, but to peace. Veterans' sacrifices, their carelessness of self, spared our generation and our children's generation from oppression and war. Today there are approximately 75,900 veterans of the Second World War. Even though the average age is 91, long past retirement, many remain active and involved in their communities, sharing memories with students and young people, working in churches and community organizations. To paraphrase Winston Churchill, they have given so much for so long to so many. As we pay tribute to the Battle of the Atlantic this Sunday and Victory in Europe Day that falls on Monday, we believe it's more important than ever that we ensure these stories of bravery and sacrifice remain alive. Sacrifices and achievements of brave Canadians during the Second World War were great and covered a broad spectrum of efforts. One of those efforts, perhaps a less known effort, was the Merchant Navy. As you all know, Canada's Merchant Navy played a critical role in the war effort, carrying desperately needed equipment, fuel, goods, and personnel to Europe and around the world. These brave men and women did this vital job, knowing that their ships were prime targets for enemy action. Often German submarines waited beneath the waters to cut off the supply routes by blowing up the ships. A total of 12,000 men and women served in Canada's Merchant Navy. More than 25,000 merchant ship voyages were made during the Second World War. More than 70 Canadian merchant ships were sunk by enemies, and over 1,700 merchant mariners lost their lives. To acknowledge the contribution of these brave men and women in ensuring victory in Europe, I will be tabling a private member's bill this afternoon, the Merchant Navy Veterans Day Act. The bill recognizes the efforts of Merchant Navy veterans, not only in the Battle of the Atlantic, but throughout the various conflicts in which Canada has participated, and the thousands of lives that have been lost to ensure our democracy, not only in this country, but all around the world. The legislation will echo federal legislation that proclaims September 3rd in each year as Merchant Navy Veterans Day. This legislation was tabled federally in the House of Commons in 2001 by the then Member of Parliament in my riding of Simcoe Grey, Mr. Paul Bonwick, and it subsequently passed in 2003. Since then, other provinces have followed suit. British Columbia proclaimed September 3rd Merchant Navy Day in 2004. The provinces of Saskatchewan and Manitoba made similar proclamations in their respective provinces in 2015. The Honourable Paul Davis, Premier of Newfoundland and Labrador, has officially recognized the sacrifices and contributions of both the Allied Merchant Navy and the American Merchant Navy. The Honourable Brian Gallant, Premier of New Brunswick, has delivered a similar message. And in 2016, the province of Nova Scotia introduced their proclamation and it passed. Mr. Bonwick began the federal initiative after being approached by a local resident and Navy veteran from my riding in Wasaga Beach, Mr. Jack Stapleton. Jack had joined the Merchant Navy in 1943 and served on the seas until the mid-1980s. Jack has since sadly passed away, but at the time of the federal legislation, he spoke about his experience in the Merchant Navy and after the war. He described how veterans of the Merchant Navy were never recognized after the war and were often treated like second-class citizens. The unknown guys, he would call them. He noted that Merchant Navy veterans had difficulty getting jobs because they were not considered regular veterans. Many ended up working overseas. Jack ended up sailing on foreign ships for many years. For many like Jack, the federal legislation and proper recognition of veterans in the Merchant Navy was a long time coming. All of us hope the bill I'll be bringing forward today will only add to the recognition of those brave men and women here in Ontario and across the country. And finally, I would like to recognize Mr. Stéphane Ouellette, President and CEO of the Merchant Navy Commemorative Theme Project, for taking the initiative to promote the significance of September 3rd across Canada. Again, thank you for being here today. Thank you for your sacrifices. Thank you for your service. And again, thank you to all three parties and all members of the legislature for their support. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that leave be given to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Proclaim Merchant Navy Veterans Day, and that it now be read the first time.
Mr. Wilson moves that leave be given to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Proclaim Merchant Navy Veterans Day, and it now be read for the first time. Is it the pleasure of the House the motion carry? Carried.
This is a bill entitled An Act to Proclaim Merchant Navy Veterans Day. First reading of the bill, première lecture du projet de loi.
Thank you. The member for a short statement.
Speaker, the bill proclaims September 3rd in each year as Merchant Navy Veterans Day. With this legislation, I'm asking members of this House to recognize the efforts of the Merchant Navy veterans who, throughout the various conflicts in which Canada has participated and the thousands of lives that have been lost, serve to ensure our democracy not only in this country but all around the world. I would like to recognize Mr. Stéphane Ouellette, President and CEO of the Merchant Navy Commemorative Theme Project, for taking the initiative to promote the significance of September 3rd all across Canada. Thank you.